Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. It is Sunday night, May 24th, and my name is Glenn Rawson. I welcome you. I thank you for joining me for this fireside. And for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to share a series of stories. And this week, they are coming from the trail, the California, Oregon, Pony Express, and Pioneer Mormon Trail. The reason for that is Wednesday, I'm going to be back out on the trail. Now, I came home just a couple of days ago from church history, all the way from Palmyra, New York to Carthage, Illinois. And now we're doing phase 2 or chapter 2 of church history, which is the Great Trail and the exodus of the pioneers out of Nauvoo into the Salt Lake Valley. So I guess as a way of setting the stage for that tour that's coming up, I wanted to talk about some stories from the trail. Now, by the way, just so that I make mention of this, I'm leaving on Wednesday on that trail tour, but that tour is still open. We've got just a couple more seats available. If you would like to go on that trail, it's not too late on that tour, rather. It is not too late. We're going to keep it open as of Tuesday, and we'll leave on Wednesday morning. If you're interested in going, if you want to go after you've watched this fireside, why, or go to TetonStagelines.com or historyofthesaints.org, and you can get the information and sign up as of Tuesday. So again, we'd love to have you. All right. It's only a 4-day tour. And then after that, the week after is the Spirit of the Saints Utah tour. And that's where we're going to be going to the Pioneer Temples of Utah. And that one departs on June 4th. And that one is only 3 days long. So those are the next 2 tours that I'm going to be on, just for your information. So I will be here in my studio next week, but I'll be out on the trail during the week. All right. As always, I believe in the power of prayer. My prayers, and especially your prayers tonight. And I ask for the Spirit of the Lord as I share 7 stories now that took place on the trail. Okay? All right. First one. The Ellsworth Handcart Company left Florence, Nebraska on July the 16th, 1856. They had 280 people, 56 handcarts, and 4 wagons. The wagons were for the purpose of hauling the company's food and supplies. Mary Ann Jones, age 19, was in that company, and she recorded the following in her diary. She said, "The Lord was with us by his Spirit, for although tired and footsore, we could sing the songs of Zion as we went along. Some stomachs may recoil at a supper cooked in the water, dug in a buffalo wallow, and cooked with buffalo chips, but it tasted good to us. We came to an immense herd of buffalo. It seemed as if the whole prairie was moving. We waited for over an hour for them to cross the road so we could go on. A very remarkable thing happened on the Platte River. One of the oxen died, and Brother Ellsworth, now he's the captain, was asking the brethren what could be done. Could they put a cow in the team so we could move on? When one of the men said, 'Look, Brother Ellsworth, that steer on the hill.' They turned and looked, and there stood a big fat steer," she said, "looking at us. Brother Ellsworth said, 'The Lord has sent him to help us into the valley. Go get him so we can move on.' And they did so. And he worked as good as the others." But then she said, "When we got within 2 days' travel of Salt Lake, we met some teams sent out from the valley with provisions and to help us in. The next morning, when the boys went to round up the cattle to start, that steer was gone. They hunted for hours, but we never saw him again. He went as mysteriously as he came. Brother Ellsworth said, the Lord lent him to us as long as we needed him." End of quote. Wonderful story. Mary Ann went on and captured the intrepid spirit of those pioneers and why they made that arduous journey that they did. She said, quote, "We had reached the goal and on foot all the way. I never left my handcart for a day and only rode over 2 rivers. We waded streams, crossed high mountains, and pulled through heavy sands, leaving comfortable homes, fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters. And what for? To be where we could hear a prophet's voice and live with the saints of God. I have never seen the day," she said, "I regretted my trip." We arrived in the Salt Lake Valley the 26th of September, 1856. End of quote. My dear friends, that is in part what that trail is all about. To gather with the saints of God where the saints were at the time, to hear a prophet's voice, to follow the keys and receive the ordinances of the temple. That is why our people crossed the plains. Okay? Next story. This one comes dear to my heart because on the last tour, I had a young woman with me on that tour who was a descendant of Thomas Bullock. Hence, I'd like to share this story because I didn't get to share it with her on the tour. I hope you keep a journal, because it very well may be that someday in the future that the simplest thing you write in your journal can change someone's life. I'm a student of pioneer journals. I love reading their diaries, their journals, and even their letters. And one day, I was in the church archives searching through 19th century pioneer journals. I was more or less just aimlessly thumbing through the diary of one pioneer immigrant by the name of Thomas Bullock. Bullock was an English convert to Mormonism. He was part of that last company of Latter-day Saints, ruthlessly driven out of Nauvoo, Illinois in September of 1846 without adequate food or shelter or provisions. They were the poor camp. They were driven out of Nauvoo across the river and took up residence in a filthy slough. They were poor. Again, they had no means to travel and nowhere else to go, trapped against the river. Bullock himself had been terribly ill with malaria. Finally, rescuers came and loaded them up for the 71-day trip across Iowa to winter quarters. Now, I read Bullock's account and was moved about that journey. And then I came to his entry of Friday, October 16th, 1846. It read as follows. Between 2 and 3 this morning, Sister Joan Campbell was delivered of a child which was dead. Immediately after delivery, she was seized with a chill, and in less than an hour, she was a corpse. When she was driven from Nauvoo, Bullock continued, she was in perfect health, but living on the slough opposite and exposure brought on chills and then shakes, which has cut her thread of life. He added this is the effects of persecution by the Illinois mob. End of quote. The next day, Joan Campbell was buried on the Iowa prairie. Joan Campbell, Bullock wrote this about her. About 3, Sister Campbell was laid in the grave. I read a portion of the hymns and Father Bosley prayed. Thus he said, have I seen the saints laid low in the wilderness, followed by one single mourner, having been banished from the land of their adoption by a brutal mob on account of her religion. End of quote. Now, I've read stories of their persecution, but for some reason on that day, it was never as real or as meaningful as when I read it in Bullock's diary. These people that crossed the plains, they were refugees. They were exiles. They were mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, real people making the journey of a lifetime. Now, I'm grateful to those at the time who were wise enough and quick to observe and kept a journal. Otherwise, we would know so little about that trail. Because now, what once may have been mundane to them is now made most meaningful by time and perspective. And I suspect that's going to happen again. So again, I'm grateful for those who kept journals and captured history. And I pray that you are keeping a journal, because someday your descendants will yearn after you and your family with the same intensity that I seek pioneers on the trail. Keep a journal. It's not too late to start. Even the tiniest snippet captures a moment of history. All right. Next story. This one actually is really personal. It comes from the diary of Newel Knight. Now, when I was on this last tour with my group, we went to Colesville, where the Knight family and all of their relatives lived and formed the Colesville branch. Now, this diary entry takes place April 24th, 1846. And the perspective is this. Imagine that date, that all of these pioneers are coming out of Nauvoo, crossing the river, bound to follow the prophets across the plains and the prairies into the Rocky Mountains to a destination they know not where. But in leaving, consider what they left behind and how hard that must have been. Newel wrote this, April 24th. We left the Mississippi about noon. We ascended the bluff. This is on the west side of the river. Here we all halted and took a farewell view of our delightful city that we had seen and helped to rear even from its infancy. We also beheld the magnificent temple rearing its lofty tower toward the heavens, which speaks volumes in honor of the wisdom and greatness of our martyred prophet, who was the founder of this magnificent temple, as well as the perseverance of so many and industry of the saints who had to labor with the sword in one hand and their toils in the other ever since the commencement of that noble house. We also took a farewell look at our comfortable homes we had labored so hard to rear for the comfort of our families. While beholding and pondering upon all this, I felt my dependence upon God and asked for his protecting care to be over us on our journey. Yea, my heart did swell within me because of the things which I beheld. For I beheld with one glance of the eye from the eminence where I stood the noble works of Joseph the prophet and seer, and Hiram the patriarch, with whom I had been acquainted even from their boyhood. I knew their worth, and I mourned their loss. O God, the eternal Father, I ask thee in the name of Jesus, thy Son, to let thy blessings rest upon us who are now here, standing upon thy footstool and covered with the heavens. For by this, our present situation and sacrifice, we do witness unto thee that we are determined to be faithful unto thee all the remainder of our days upon the earth, and to be gathered with thy people. Wilt thou give unto us thy Holy Spirit to enlighten our understanding? Let thine angels guard us on our journey, and thy presence go before us. Preserve us from the power of the destroyer, from sickness and from accidents, and from evils of every kind, and incline our hearts, and incline the hearts of the people favorably towards us and to all thy saints, as we're journeying through to the wilderness. Wilt thou soften the hearts of our enemies, even as thou didst Pharaoh towards the children of Israel. Send men from the north and from the south and from the east and from the west to buy their houses and their lands and their furniture and all that is left in the hands of the committee for the benefit of thy needy saints, that thy people may be provided with teams and wagons and provisions and with clothing, with every needful thing to the journey. And on he goes. That lengthy journal entry gives us some idea just what a struggle and sacrifice it was for those saints to leave everything behind, whether they came from England or anywhere else in the British Isles, or whether they came from Nauvoo, or whether they came from the eastern United States, wherever those immigrant fathers and mothers of yours came from, they left a history, a heritage, and a people behind. Can you imagine yourself packing everything up and setting out, going east on that trail, or anywhere else the prophets would call us to go, leaving it all behind? Now, that was April of 1846. Fast forward now to December of 1846, and Newel Knight is way out on the trail in Nebraska territory. They're in winter camp called Fort Ponca near the Niobrara River, when a fire swept down on the camp and threatened to burn everything in the Mormon settlement. Newel and the others turned out and fought that fire until near 10:30 at night in the bitter cold. They fought the fire to ground and put it out. But in so doing, Newel contracted pneumonia. And now, January 1st, 1847, Newel is so sick. He wrote this in his diary: I scarcely know why I am thus anxious, why this world appears so trifling, or the things of this world. I almost desire to leave this tenement of clay, that my spirit may soar aloft and no longer be held in bondage. Yet my helpless family seem to need my protection. For their sakes, and if I yet have more to do on earth, or can do more good to the living than to the dead, I am willing to remain yet longer in the flesh. But then Newel writes this in his diary, and I held that diary. I read it in the diary as he wrote it. He wrote, Thy will, O Lord, be done. And he underscored it again and again and again. He meant it. 10 days later, he passed away and lies buried today on a bluff near Fort Ponca in an unknown grave. Lydia Knight, his dear wife, went on with 6 children, some of them ill, and on across the plains into the Salt Lake Valley and into history. So I want you to consider just how difficult it would be if we were called to do the same thing. My love and admiration for them only grows stronger the more I know about them. Next story. In the cold fall and winter of 1856, there were many men who came out of the Salt Lake Valley or along the Wasatch Front, who went back out east on the trail to help bring in the Willie, Martin, Hunt, and Hodgent immigrant companies. John Riggs was one of them. His group met the suffering immigrants near Fort Bridger and assisted them on toward the valley. As they journeyed west, him with the handcart company, it began to snow in Echo Canyon and dropped about 3 feet. The train of about 75 wagons struggled through the deep and drifting snow, realizing that if it was this bad in the lowlands, What would the top of Big Mountain look like in the Wasatch Range? So John later said, I went ahead on horseback, leaving the rest of the relief party behind. It was very difficult, but I managed to struggle through the snow to the top of Big Mountain. I was quite alone. But here met 2 men with 6 yoke of oxen who had come up the west side of the mountain. They had come from Provo to assist the handcart company. When I told them that their teams were needed at the farthest end of the train, meaning on the east side of the mountain, they said they would go back to their camp and remain until the next day. Well, John managed to persuade the men not to go back, but to follow him and meet the oncoming handcart train. Together they descended Big Mountain until they met the advanced wagons, rescue wagons, bringing in the Martin Company. John said, I realized that many of the people would perish if left on the mountain that night. My plan was to take the oxen and hitch on to the first 2 wagons and pull them through the snow and thus open the road and enable the whole train to pass through. My advice, he said, was followed, and we succeeded in getting the entire train over by 10 o'clock that night. The company then passed quickly to a campground where they were met with plenty of firewood prepared by the men who had been left behind. By the time John and the other rescuers finished the day's labor on Big Mountain, the cut through the snowbank at the top of Big Mountain measured between 10 and 15 feet deep. It was so deep, this narrow little cut, that John said you could lay a pole across the chasm and a covered wagon could easily pass under it. End of quote. Well, John Riggs went on to a very useful and productive life. And yet, as he said it, he would always consider his service in bringing in those lost immigrants in the fall of '56 as, quote, the big feat of my life, end of quote. One writer later wrote this of John. John had a tender heart for all and was known for assisting the poor and unfortunate, end of quote. Most of you don't even know who this man is. Perhaps, though, it was the tragic events of John's own childhood that rendered him so compassionate and diligent for the poor. For you see, when John was just a boy of 5, his mother suddenly and tragically passed away. Fresh in my memory, he said, is the death of my dear mother. There was a dreadfully sad scene, he continued, among her poor children following her death. It was simply heartrending to hear little sister Phoebe, only 2 years old, cry out for her mother as if her little heart would break. We were staying at a neighbor's when Father came and told us the sad news. He wept most bitterly, for he realized all the sorrow of the situation. End of quote. Many years later, John himself, as a grown man and a father, would remember, quote, crying so hard for his mother and how a kiss from her would have softened the trials of his younger years. End of quote. John's mother is famous in church history. Her name was Julia Clapp Murdock. She passed away in 1831, shortly after giving birth to twins. Those twins were adopted by Joseph and Emma Smith. John? Well, that's John Riggs Murdock, Julia's son. We all know the story of how those twins were taken and raised by Joseph and Emma. But what happened to John, Julia's oldest son? He became an orphan. His dad was gone on missions. John was passed from family to family, becoming, as one writer said, anyone's boy. Maybe that is why John volunteered and sacrificed and went out on that trail in 1856 to the rescue. Maybe that's why his compassion for the unfortunate was always there and made him beloved by all. John Riggs Murdock. Next story. Maria Jackson Normington heard the sister in the congregation of the Whitechapel branch in London speaking in tongues on that significant day in 1855. Well, Maria stood up and gave the interpretation, also a gift of the Spirit. And what was spoken was a promise given to the branch president of that branch, James Godson Blake, that said, quote, I, the Lord, am well pleased with the offering made by my servant, Elder Blake. And notwithstanding, he shall see the angel of death laying waste on his right and on his left, on his front and on his rearward. Yet he and his family shall gather to Zion in safety, and not one of them shall fall by the way. End quote. Now, interestingly enough, and that's another story for another time, that promise would be fulfilled miraculously to the letter for the Blake family. But that same promise was not given to Maria's family, she who interpreted the tongues. Previous to Thomas and Maria Normington leaving London for America, they buried 3 of their children. After they arrived in America, their little son, Daniel, died August the 12th, 1856, as the family was halfway between their journey from Iowa City to the resupply camp in Florence, Nebraska. Out in the middle of Iowa, they lost their son. Shortly after that, Maria gave birth to a child whom they named Thomas, and he died shortly after. Then, as you know, in Wyoming, the winter snows caught the Martin Company near the last crossing of the Platte, near present-day Casper, Wyoming. It was after crossing those icy and treacherous waters of the Platte that Thomas, Maria's husband, and her other son Ephraim succumbed to the cold, and both of them passed away. Imagine this. Maria had now buried 6 children and her husband, and yet she didn't quit. She didn't murmur. She went on. It was written of her that she had, quote, a jolly and cheerful disposition. As the sufferings and privation of the Martin Handcart Company increased in the days after that river crossing, it is recorded in the family records that Maria's great faith and determination finally caused her to give her meager rations to her 3 little girls and eat dirt in an attempt to satisfy her own hunger pains. She walked until her feet were so frozen and sore that she crawled along on her hands and knees. And when her hands were so frozen that she could no longer use them, she went on her knees and elbows. Overcome with hardship, starvation, and grief, Maria slipped into unconsciousness and remembered nothing of the last part of the journey in the rescue wagon sent by John Parker. John's son, William, drove that wagon, took Maria and her daughters to the valley and later to his father's home, where they continued to be nursed back to health. Maria Jackson Normington suffered immeasurably on the journey to Zion, lost so much, yet we have no record of murmuring or comparing her journey to the Blake family. In fact, she actually saved James Godson Blake one night on the trail when he was left behind. And upon learning that he had been left behind, she gathered up men in the camp and went back along the trail and brought James Godson Blake into the camp, thus fulfilling the very promise she had delivered through the gift of tongues. Maria was not only the voice of that promise, but she was in part the means of fulfilling it. Maria was faithful and cheerful all the remainder of her days. She died in Virgin City, Utah, March 19th, 1881, at the age of 61. My dear friends, one of the great blessings that comes of studying the lives of those pioneers is realizing the sacrifices and the obedience in their lives to follow a prophet, to come to the temples, and to gather with the saints. Of all of those, Maria is right there among them who gave a significant amount to do that. I, for one, am inspired by that example. Get up, keep moving, quit whining, whimpering, and complaining, and just get there. Next story. Joseph Ainsworth and his wife, Mary, joined the church during the first mission of Heber C. Kimball in England in 1837. On July 4th, 1854, a daughter, Mary Jane, was born to the family, bringing the number of family members to 5. Well, as the story would continue, when Mary Jane was only 2 years old, her father passed away. In 1862, the family then sailed to America on the steamship Manchester for the purpose of gathering to the saints. There was Mary Jane, her mother, and her 2 older brothers, Joseph and James. They landed at Castle Garden, New York, then made their way to Florence, Nebraska by train, where they joined up with the Henry Miller Wagon Company. Mary Jane's mother was ill the entirety of the voyage and was still not well as they began their journey across the plains on August the 5th, 1862. And then this story. One day, somewhere along the trail, it was late in the day and almost time for the whole company to make camp. Well, accordingly, Mary Jane and her brother went out onto the plains to gather buffalo chips for their evening cook fire. Mary Jane and her brother became so intent on looking down and looking for buffalo chips that they wandered out some distance from the camp and failed to notice that the train moved on down the road further in their absence. When the 2 children looked up, they realized the 2 little lambs were lost. Darkness closed in upon them, and understandably, their terror became even more as the wolves began to howl all around him. They were far out away from civilization, no one to help them, surrounded by wolves. At that point, the 2 little ones remembered what their mother had taught them. They knelt down right there and asked Heavenly Father to, quote, keep them from harm and to guide them safely to where the company was camped, end of quote. According to the family history, right after this, the 2 children saw an old lady who said to them, don't cry, my little dears. I'll take you to the camp. Follow me. Now, they didn't know her. She wasn't a member of their camp. And when she had led them almost all the way into the camp, she suddenly vanished. When they related the experience to their mother, she told them that old lady was surely an angel sent to help them. And who can doubt that mother's word? For what mortal being would be out there in the middle of a trackless waste, so far from human habitation, all alone at night at that age? Mary Jane and her family came on safely to the Salt Lake Valley. Her mother remarried in 1865. Then 1 year later, Mary Jane's stepfather was injured and died a few days later. The day he died, their wheat stacks, their hay, everything they had burned to the ground. The shock of losing everything they had and her husband's death was too much for the weakened body of her mother, and she died a week later. She went on to her final rest, October 1866. Her last words to Mary Jane were this: listen, my dear, never leave the gospel. It is true, and I want to meet you on the other side. After that much sacrifice, that kind of determination. I'm of the opinion, brothers and sisters, that it's because of the price that they were required to pay for their faith, that their faith was so strong. Mary Jane never did leave the gospel. She became the mother of 10 children, a nurse and primary president for 20 years, and a faithful daughter of God. She is buried today in Brigham City, Utah. Okay, last story for tonight, brothers and sisters. And this story isn't a pioneer story. I don't know where this came from, but it came to me just a couple of days ago, and I wrote it down to share it with you. Take it for what it's worth. I remember an awful night when I was just a boy living on the ranch near Leadore, Idaho. For whatever reason, I had gone down the road to the neighbor's ranch with my best friend with me. My best friend was a little collie dog named Stockins. We had been together since I was a boy and he was a pup. And it's hard to tell which was the most of a pup. He was some of my earliest and fondest memories and my best friend. I still can picture him frolicking about my feet. Well, somehow on that trip to the neighbors, we got separated. It got dark. As I started towards home, I heard a commotion. I'd heard it before. It sounded like a dogfight. And as I drew closer, I realized that a pack of ranch dogs had set on my dog, Stockins, and they were tearing him to pieces. That little dog was giving it all he had in the fight, but he was hopelessly outnumbered and outsized. Well, I didn't hesitate. I ran into the fray, yelling, kicking, fighting to keep him out of the barking, snapping melee. Finally, the dogs ran off, and I turned to Stockins. He was torn to pieces, bleeding everywhere. I remember most clearly that those dogs had broken and mangled his back leg. He was wounded in more places than I care to tell. He was in bad shape, weeping. I stooped down and picked up my little friend and carried him home. My mom and dad helped me tend to him. For days, Stockins hovered between life and death, and I shed many anxious tears. Finally, tough little dog began to recover. But for the rest of his life, that one back leg flopped uselessly, totally worthless. But notwithstanding his injuries, he was always game. He was a plucky little character. When it came time to move cows, notwithstanding he only had 3 legs, he would get right in there and thoroughly enjoy himself making those cows move, biting and yipping. Now, Stockins has been gone now for more than 50 years, but he was my friend, and I loved him, even if no one else did. And I hope a day comes that I get to see him again. Well, this is what came to me as I contemplated that story about him. I realized that we live in an interesting age. Our society has become in large measure like a pack of ruthless dogs. At the first scent of blood, or in other words, at the first sign of a mistake or a weakness in the public eye, social media surrounds that person, pounces on them, and tears them apart. It isn't their physical body, it's their reputation. Their family, their character, their livelihood are shredded right before the world's eyes and their own eyes, and they are left as bloodied and wounded as the Samaritan on the road to Jericho. It is wrong. And those who pile on and pack in and engage in such destructive behavior will sooner or later face and then feel all the harm they have caused. And I know, I was there. I remember a time once when I made mistakes in the public eye, and there were those who stepped forward and protected me, shielded me, until I could get back up, heal, and contribute once more. When I consider what could have happened to me had they been a pack of dogs, I thank the Almighty for their compassion and their wisdom. It is always well to remember in such times as when we see someone make a mistake, that the next time it very well could be you. And how would you want to be treated in the public eye for your mistakes? My dear friends, God bless you.